I want to do three things, and actually I should explain first. Class Centre for Labour and Social Studies, and we obviously wanted to call ourselves Class, and then thought of a way in which we could think about filling that out. So it was set up in the UK, essentially by the trade union movement and the left in 2012, and I've been working there for the last 6 months or so. And what it does is that it tries to disrupt the kind of common narrative that we hear in terms of economics, in terms of politics. And the ways in which we do that is that I and others in my team will go out and do a lot of media. So whenever anything comes up, say on something like the Panama Papers and tax, you know, we're kind of a voice for the left. And I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. And we also work with union reps, so workers, everyday people, to kind of give them some tools and educate them in some of these broader trends. So we do a bit of the translation between the amazing work that academics do, so that others can pick it up that are interested. So we do this kind of public narrative piece. And my own background is doing kind of economic research, but it's been really interesting doing a lot more of this sort of public-facing work. So I'm going to do three things. Given that it's the last session, I just want to sum up the challenges that we've spoken about in terms of how we tackle inequality very quickly. I'm going to present some of the concrete policies. Again, you know, it can get really boring, the long list of policies, so I'm just going to keep that brief. And I'm really then going to come on to talk about and pick up some of the points that were made earlier in terms of the public narrative and what needs to be done there and the concrete steps that we can start to make. And this picture here, just to keep you interested, this is my father-in-law. And I put him up there because he is, so he works in a factory, he used to fix TVs, and he then, obviously, technology changed, and he had to change jobs, and he went to work in a factory. He's a Turkish immigrant. He's someone that voted for Brexit because he doesn't want more immigration. He's a wonderful man, by the way. I love him very much, but yeah, so politically we do not agree. And a lot of the things I end up doing is testing ideas on him, and he says a lot of really interesting things to me, and I'm going to pick up on some of those things along the way just to bring it to life. So just quickly, just to sum up where we've got to, and I think there has been a lot of agreement here, and I've personally found it really valuable to hear so much agreement, and it's just made me feel stronger in the way that I'm coming to this issue. So tackling inequality presents a number of challenges. Firstly, of course, there are multiple sources of inequality across capital, labor, and across politics and issues of political capture. And one of the things that is clear is that some of the outcomes of inequality have also become drivers. So we have this vicious cycle as people have spoken about. And to break that cycle and to intervene in that cycle, there's of course no silver bullet. We'll have to intervene in several places. So I think we agree that inequality is a choice and that policy can go a long way to address that. But I think, and this is sort of reflecting on some of the discussions about trade unions as well, many of the policies that have worked previously, so in an era when we did have more equality, seem out of step with the world that we have now in terms of technological change, in terms of where the public are, in terms of globalization and the way in which sometimes it feels like it's difficult, say, to do something about tax in one country if another country doesn't do it as well. And also where trade unions have been are kind of in decline, and where there isn't money, and I think this is something that we don't talk about enough. So I'm going to present a wish list of policies, but one of the things that I will hear again and again is where's the money for that? And I'll talk about some creative solutions that people have thought about, and I think that's really key. If this isn't just a wish list, this is something practically we can do. Finally, and we've drawn on this a lot, is the kind of great gulf between what needs to be done and where kind of the political world is right now, and the public is as well, as typified by my wonderful father-in-law. So we're really a long way from making that a reality, and in some cases, and I'll talk a bit about Brexit, we've spoken about it quite a lot, but as someone that grew up in London and has seen this fallout, I just want to pick up on some of those points. But it seems like we're going in the wrong direction in some ways, and that's symbolized by Trump and Brexit, and I'll get to that. So I'm not going to try and pick up all of these challenges, but I'm just going to pick up especially on a couple around policies, the number of policies we need to take, and the public narrative. So I've been thinking about this vicious circle for a while, and I have to thank, actually, Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung gave me some funding a couple of years ago when I worked at a great organization, a great think tank called the New Economics Foundation. I would encourage you all to look at them. They do some really interesting work. And so we thought about this vicious cycle, and it was really great when Terry mentioned it the other day. I mean, this is just the way in which we depicted it. Because obviously, like, there's a long list of things that are drawing, that are causing inequality. And one way in which we try to articulate this to the public, to the informed public and people that were interested in this, was kind of what happens through the life course. You're born in this lottery of birth, initial inequalities, and how that is grows through your lifetime or grows through a generation because of several influences. So from issues of the labour market. I mean, we did put in childcare. Childcare is a big issue in the early years. We did put in some issues of education, partly because in the UK, for those of you that don't know, there's this there's a clear hierarchy in terms of class, and we have this age-old elite, which basically go to these top private schools, places like Eton, and that gives them a direct course into Oxford or Cambridge universities, and then on to government or media and these top jobs. And that has only strengthened in recent years. So we did talk in this kind of way in which inequality is growing about the need to address that elitism within the education system. And then through skill bias change and all the way through up to financialization, and we spoke about external influences in terms of globalization, in terms of financialization, and we looked at what in particular was driving inequality. And we did this for the UK, but I think a lot of these, again, are relevant to other countries. And then we came back to tax. Now, I've always thought about this in terms of what we can do to pre-distribute incomes and then what we can do to redistribute incomes. And when we were drawing this for the first time, and this is something I've used for some years now, it was clear that if you just wait to the end to deal with this, then there's a lot of damage that's potentially done along the way. So moving to that vicious cycle, we, a couple of years ago, had this symposium where we wanted to talk about what policies would address some of these factors, these root causes of inequality. Now, of course, loads of academics came. We had all the kind of left-wing people in the UK come along, and we drew this virtuous cycle of action. And we started off, and this was really important to me, actually partly because of your work on the Palmer Index and on the kind of discussions that have been had around GDP, and this the GDP indicator basically dominating economists and economies as the thing to do, like growth in GDP measures. And of course, Stiglitz has done some work around this as well. So one of the things we said is that we need some new indicators alongside GDP to change the incentives, to change what governments are looking to achieve. So some measures of inclusive growth, some measures of wealth inequality, etc. And then we drew this chart with a number of different, there's a lot more detail in the report. I can send it round afterwards. I don't want to labor too much on this, because again, it's kind of similar to what Michael just said in some ways. I think one of the things that really stood out to me was this issue of the banks and money and financialization, which is often missed in these discussions about inequality. So often what happens, as we've all seen and been frustrated by, I think, is the kind of focus on education, the focus on social policy to correct issues of inequality rather than economic policy. So we did look at things like what we could do to break up the banks, what we could do so that you would break up some of the investment, global activity that they do in trading from the actual aim of banks as they were meant to be in the beginning, which was to lend and grow the economy. In a real sense, rather in this kind of shadow economy. And we looked as well at some examples from Germany and South Korea on having a green investment banks that essentially have these very low levels of interest to green up the economy. And I think this was really important. One of the things I should have said is that, of course, all of this has to come from a vision of society going forward. And that's not just about less inequality, that's also about less social inequalities and discrimination, about more people engagement. So whenever we thought about this, we thought about what would allow people to have more say. So economic democracy, some of the points that you raised, Michael, on having people on boards was really important. But an environmentally sustainable economy was also ways in which we were thinking about solutions. And again, that's something that gets put aside. I was really glad that Katrine spoke about it yesterday. But in terms of thinking about the solutions, we should be thinking about what we can do to green the economy and create good jobs. So there's the list, and it's very long. And this was just one way in which we could depict it. And we thought also about what we could do in terms of getting the money to do this. And so some points around tax and, of course, more progressive taxation, closing loopholes. The UK has lots of tax havens. It could do a lot, and it has done some things in recent years, to be fair, to do something about the tax havens. And the money lost not just to the UK, but the whole rest of the world, and some of the money to developing countries as well. And we also spoke about quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing has been this process of course, printing money, and essentially it's just gone into banks. But what if we did green quantitative easing? What if we did a house-building quantitative easing? If there was a way to take that money, and the UK again has said that it's going to do a whole new batch of quantitative easing because of potential economic slowdown because of Brexit. Instead of channeling that into ways in which means that we have more asset inflation for the rich, let's try and invest it directly into the real economy. So there's some conversations that are happening there on where we can get the money from. So one of the things that really stood out to me after reflecting on these conversations we had with sort of 30 or so experts was that no one mentions politics or politicians as a way to deal to get this virtuous cycle. And it was a couple of years ago, so we hadn't had Corbyn, who's basically the leader of the left Labour Party in the UK, and is seen as kind of parallel to Bernie Sanders in some ways. So I'm going to talk about that, and in terms of power. We also did have in here, of course, we had trade unions involved, so we spoke about what we can do to bring back some more collective action. So I want to talk about Brexit. I was thoroughly depressed about it for a while, so only finally kind of able to talk about it now. So this was the kind of thing that was said. And it's interesting because it's essentially like we want control of our country, and it's not so different to some of the things that I guess Trump is saying. Many people saw it as the working class, and it was very much an older working class as well that voted to leave. And a lot of people saw it as a kind of bloody nose to the elites. But in a way, what it wasn't the elites in the UK, it was kind of misplaced to the elites in the EU, which was really interesting. So you'd go out and speak to people and you'd ask them why they didn't want to... I mean, I couldn't ask, by the way, because this was so racially and immigrant charged, this whole discussion. People wouldn't be honest with someone like me. It had to be some of my white colleagues that spoke to them about this sad state of affairs. And they would say, oh, you know, the EU, all these rules are made over there, it's an issue of democracy, but they would also say that, we have no say. And so and actually it was very misplaced. So when you asked them about the policies that they said that they were upset about, they'd say things like the National Health Service and public policy, the public services, that there wasn't enough investment in those services. Now that has nothing to do with the EU. But the way in which this campaign was run was very much to manipulate these people away from the kind of country elites in the UK to this EU. And we have to remember that the Leave campaign was run by elites as well. So it was not a kind of clear-cut story of giving a bloody nose to the elites in the UK, because actually one of the main guys on the Leave campaign side is one of these Eton-educated, Oxbridge-educated, effectively someone that liked the EU but saw political opportunity. So we had a lot of this, and it was very geographical as well. It very much reflected inequalities that have been growing in the UK for a long time. So a group of people that have been ignored for a long time, manipulated into, instead of blaming the politicians in the UK, blaming the EU politicians. And then also really hating London, essentially basically because what's happened in the UK is that we have this sort of, a lot of our economic commerce and prosperity happens in London and the southeast, and a lot of the rest of the country has been left after deindustrialization effectively to rot. So this was also another way, and you saw real strong geographical patterns in who voted to leave. Now, something my father-in-law said, so it's not just Brexit. Something my father-in-law said to me was that, we're speaking about housing, and there's this big issue of housing in London because like the house prices have gone up so much because we get the global elite that come put money into our housing market, and that causes this ratcheting up effect. There's other things as well, but that's one of the key things. So I was talking to my father-in-law and saying, you know, we need to do something about housing. And he said, do you know what, Faiza? The thing that would help housing is if these people on benefits and immigrants stopped stopped taking up all the housing. And it was just, and here it was, and there it was right in front of me. And I think this is why I'm both optimistic and pessimistic, is that the divide and rule amongst the working class is so clear in the UK now. So even people of color will blame other people in the working class. They'll blame each other. And I said to him, actually, Baba, it's much more to do with the rich than it is to do with the poor. And this is a classic example of us blaming our neighbors rather than blaming the political elite. And I thought it was, it was challenging. I mean, I think he took it on, but he probably just smiled and nodded his head to get me to shut up. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, in terms of the public narrative, there's some really negative examples, and I think Brexit really brought that up. But I also want to turn very quickly, because I know I'm meant to end, this is one of my last slides, is what's happening on the flip side. And I think, again, this sort of reflects the Trump-Sanders thing as well, is that we have this left political leader, and there are issues here. I'm not going to say that he's as great as Bernie Sanders. Jeremy Corbyn, and you see all these young people around him. And effectively, he's been voted in as the Labour Party leader, even though within the Labour Party, MPs do not support him. What happened is that the broader public, we saw a doubling in the membership of the Labour Party coming in to vote for this guy who has very left socialist policies, who was anti-austerity, who took a stand on many issues. And it's been really interesting to watch. I mean, the Labour Party is a complete mess because of this, and because of this, it will struggle to get in power. But the strength of feeling behind him, and it's really interesting. You get it's like fans that gather around him, and you know, he's some kind of almost some kind of messiah or something. And so on the flip side, you get the kind of Brexit really angry people, and then you get people that think essentially that is all to blame immigrants, and then you get this real liberal young people, and then a kind of older middle class that are really getting behind Corbyn in a very, very strong way. So I mean, it is a bit schizophrenic in a way. So sometimes I feel positive, and sometimes I want to cry. I mean, one of the things I do take as really positive, and I am going to end now, is that I work for a think tank where we're able to go out and do media work. And in the UK, some campaigners and activists have come together to train to put together a left narrative so we can go in and talk about issues from a left perspective. And there is so much demand for us. Like, on a weekly basis, I'll get asked to go on TV 3 times. I'm one of like 30 people on a list. And it's amazing that there suddenly is more space for the left to talk. So whilst there are, it's almost like the story of extremes. I'd be interested in what you make of it, being in the UK, Jose. And so, yeah, so I guess to say on the public narrative, we're really, there's sort of both positive things happening and negative things happening. And I just to say, like, going forward, the next policy step and ways in which we can work together, and I hope we can work together off the back of this. We are doing a project in the UK which is about framing the economy in a different way, so that we can put across these arguments to the public in a non-techie way and take out some of the messages that we've discussed here. In a similar way, and we learned very much to what the right did, which was the biggest lie in terms of austerity, that we needed, that because of the bankers' crash, we needed to cut public services, essentially. They did that story so well, and we're learning from some of the ways in which they framed that in order to make a kind of left narrative. And it would be great to keep in touch with some of you about how we can do that. And just to end on a quote from Nelson Mandela, who else? On, it always seems impossible until it's done. And so whilst we may feel very far from the changes we want to see, I think there are some signs, and we have to stay positive. Thanks.
Okay, muy bien, muchas gracias.